There was a moment when you stopped recognizing yourself in the mirror, not because your face changed, but because the person staring back felt like a stranger wearing your skin. You didn't lose yourself all at once. It happened in fragments, in silent surrenders you never even noticed, until the weight of who you used to be became too heavy to carry. This is the story of the exact moment you started losing yourself, and why that moment might be the most important thing you'll ever understand about being human. It begins quietly, so quietly that most people never hear it happening. You're living your life, moving through your days, checking boxes, meeting expectations, and somewhere beneath the surface, a part of you starts to fade. Psychologists call this depersonalization, a psychological phenomenon where you begin to feel disconnected from your own thoughts, feelings, and sense of self. But the clinical term doesn't capture the terror of it. It doesn't explain what it feels like when you realize you've been performing a version of yourself for so long that you can no longer remember who you were before the performance began. Dr. Mauricio Sierra, one of the leading researchers on depersonalization at King's College London, describes it as a protective mechanism gone wrong. When the mind experiences prolonged stress, trauma, or emotional overwhelm, it creates distance between your conscious awareness and your emotional experience. It's like your brain is trying to save you from pain by numbing you to everything, including yourself. The problem is, you can't selectively numb. When you shut down the painful emotions, you shut down joy, creativity, and authentic connection too. You become a ghost in your own life, watching yourself from behind glass. The exact moment varies for everyone, but it often happens during what should be normal, even mundane experiences. You're at dinner with friends, and suddenly you're not really there. You're watching yourself laugh at jokes, nod at the right moments, play the part perfectly, but inside there's nothing, just emptiness. Or you're lying in bed next to someone you love, and you realize you can't feel it anymore. Not the love, not the warmth, not even the sadness about not feeling. You've become an observer of your own existence, and the person you're observing feels like an actor you don't recognize. Research from the University of Cambridge found that approximately 6% of people will experience chronic depersonalization at some point in their lives. But the numbers are likely much higher because most people don't recognize what's happening to them. They just know something is wrong. They describe feeling like they're living in a dream, or behind a veil, or underwater. One patient told her therapist, "It's like I died, but my body forgot to stop moving." That's the horror of it. Life continues. Responsibilities pile up. People expect you to show up. But the you that's showing up isn't really you anymore. The psychological mechanisms behind this are fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. When you repeatedly suppress your authentic thoughts, emotions, and desires to fit into expectations, whether from family, society, relationships, or career, your brain begins to dissociate from the authentic self as a survival strategy. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, trauma expert and author of The Body Keeps the Score, explains that the mind will sacrifice authenticity for safety every single time. If being yourself meant rejection, punishment, or abandonment in the past, your nervous system learned to create a false self to survive. The problem is that this false self, this mask you wear, eventually becomes so automatic that you forget it's a mask at all. Think about the small moments that led here. The time you laughed at a joke you found offensive because everyone else was laughing. The relationship you stayed in 6 months too long because leaving felt harder than staying. The career path you followed because it was practical, not because it set your soul on fire. The opinions you swallowed, the dreams you shelved, the versions of yourself you trimmed away to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold you. Each compromise was small, each betrayal of self was barely noticeable, but they accumulated like grains of sand, and one day you looked down and realized you were buried. Neuroscience offers a sobering explanation for why this process is so insidious. Brain imaging studies show that when people engage in prolonged self-suppression, the areas of the brain associated with self-referential thinking, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex, show reduced activity. Essentially, the part of your brain that maintains your sense of I starts to go quiet. Meanwhile, the default mode network, which usually activates during self-reflection and daydreaming, becomes fragmented. Your internal narrative, the story you tell yourself about who you are, begins to fracture. You lose the plot of your own life because the narrator has gone silent. But here's what makes this particularly cruel. The world around you often rewards your disappearance. When you stop pushing back, stop asserting boundaries, stop being difficult or complicated or inconveniently yourself, people tend to like you more. You become easier to be around, more accommodating, more predictable. Your erasure gets mistaken for maturity, your numbness for calm, your disconnection for stability. Society has a vested interest in your compliance, so it celebrates your fading. And you, desperate for approval and connection, mistake this celebration for evidence that you're finally doing something right. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about this phenomenon in the 19th century, long before modern psychology had the language for it. He called it the sickness unto death, a despair so deep that you lose yourself without even knowing you're lost. He argued that the greatest danger in life is not losing your life, but losing yourself while still alive. That's the existential horror of depersonalization. You're alive, you're breathing, you're moving through the world, but the essential you, the conscious, feeling, authentic being, has quietly slipped away. Many people point to a specific moment when they first noticed. A woman named Sarah described it in her therapy journal. I was putting on makeup for a work presentation, and I looked at my reflection and thought, who is this person, and what does she even want? I realized I had no idea. Not about the presentation, not about my job, not about my life. I was 34 years old, and I couldn't answer the most basic question about myself. Another man recalled standing in his childhood bedroom during a visit to his parents' house, surrounded by posters and books that once defined him, and feeling absolutely nothing. It was like looking at a museum exhibit about a person who used to exist, he said. The loss becomes more pronounced in moments that should matter. Achievements feel hollow. Promotions, awards, milestones, they happen to you, but they don't land. You smile for the photos, you say the right things, but inside there's just static. Relationships suffer because intimacy requires presence, and you're not really present anymore. You can perform connection, say, I love you, go through the motions, but there's no authentic self behind the words. Partners sense it. They say things like, you're here, but you're not really here, and they're right. But you can't explain why because you don't fully understand it yourself. Dr. Daphne Simeon, a psychiatrist who has spent decades studying depersonalization disorder, notes that one of the most distressing aspects is the meta-awareness. You're aware that you're disconnected, which creates a horrible recursive loop. You watch yourself being disconnected from yourself, which makes you feel even more disconnected. It's consciousness turning in on itself in the worst possible way. You become both the prisoner and the guard, trapped in a dissociation you can observe but can't escape. What triggers the exact moment varies, but common themes emerge from clinical research. Chronic emotional invalidation is a major factor. If you grew up in an environment where your feelings were dismissed, minimized, or punished, your brain learned that your internal experience doesn't matter. Over time, you stop consulting your own emotions when making decisions. You override your gut instincts so many times that the connection between your authentic self and your conscious awareness becomes severed. You might be walking through life making choices, but they're not your choices anymore. They're choices based on what you think you should want, not what you actually want. Trauma plays a role too, but not always the dramatic kind we see in movies. Sometimes it's the accumulation of smaller wounds, what psychologists call complex trauma or developmental trauma, the parent who loved you conditionally, the relationship where you had to shrink yourself to be loved, the workplace where being yourself meant being punished, the friend group where vulnerability was weaponized. Each experience taught you the same lesson: hide who you are to survive. And eventually, you hid so well that even you couldn't find yourself anymore. There's also the cultural dimension that we rarely discuss honestly. Modern life is fundamentally hostile to authentic selfhood. We're drowning in external validation metrics, likes, followers, productivity scores, bank balances, while losing touch with internal metrics like meaning, fulfillment, and joy. We're told to optimize ourselves, to personal brand ourselves, to perform happiness and success on social media. But optimization requires suppressing the messy, complicated human parts that don't photograph well. We've built a civilization that demands we trade our souls for status, and then we wonder why we feel empty inside. The philosopher Martin Heidegger warned about this in his concept of Das Man, the they self. He argued that most people live their lives according to what they say you should do, never stopping to ask what I actually want. You study what they say you should study. You pursue the career they say is respectable. You marry the type of person they approve of. You live in the neighborhood they consider successful. And one day, you wake up and realize your entire life has been designed by committee and you've never voted. You're living someone else's dream with your body, your time, your one irreplaceable life. But here's the thing that research keeps finding, the thing that offers a crack of light in this darkness. The moment you notice is the moment recovery becomes possible. Depersonalization persists partly because of meta-unawareness, not knowing that something is wrong. The fact that you've noticed, that you felt the disconnection, that you've recognized the stranger in the mirror, means your authentic self is still in there, still sending signals, still fighting to be heard. Awareness is the first step toward reintegration. Dr. Anthony David, who has studied dissociative disorders for over 20 years, emphasizes that reconnection requires what he calls deliberate re-embodiment. You have to systematically rebuild the connection between your conscious mind and your authentic experience. This isn't about positive thinking or forcing yourself to feel better. It's about creating space for real feelings, even uncomfortable ones, to exist again. It's about practicing tiny acts of authenticity until the muscle memory returns. It's about asking yourself, constantly and honestly, what do I actually want right now? And then, crucially, honoring the answer. This process is terrifying because it often means dismantling the life you've built around your false self. It might mean leaving relationships that only work when you're pretending. It might mean walking away from careers that pay well but kill your soul. It might mean disappointing people who love the version of you that was easier to manage. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called this becoming who you are. And he didn't mean discovering some pre-existing essential self. He meant having the courage to consciously create yourself, to choose who you want to be, rather than letting life choose for you. The journey back to yourself requires what therapists call radical self-honesty. You have to get ruthlessly real about which parts of your life are truly yours and which parts you're living for others. You have to examine every belief, every goal, every relationship, and ask, is this mine or is this something I absorbed? The answers are often uncomfortable. You might discover that the person you thought you were was largely a fiction, a character you wrote to please an audience that was never really paying attention. There's grief in this process. You'll mourn the time you lost, the opportunities you missed, the version of yourself you might have been if you'd had the courage to be real sooner. But there's also liberation. Every small act of authenticity is an act of resurrection. Every time you say what you really think, feel what you really feel, choose what you really want, you're calling yourself back from exile. You're rebuilding the bridge between who you are and who you're pretending to be, until one day the bridge disappears because there's no gap left to cross. The neuroscience supports this too. Studies on neuroplasticity show that the brain can rewire itself at any age. The parts of your brain responsible for self-awareness and authentic experience can be reactivated through consistent practice. Meditation, therapy, creative expression, spending time in nature, deep conversations, writing. These aren't just self-care cliches. They're neurological interventions that help restore the connection between your conscious awareness and your authentic self. Your brain is waiting for you to come home. It's been holding the door open this whole time. What you'll find, if you have the courage to make this journey, is that the stranger in the mirror starts to look familiar again. Not because you've gone back to who you used to be, you can't and you shouldn't, but because you finally met who you actually are. The performance ends, the mask comes off, and what's underneath isn't perfect or polished or optimized for external approval. It's messy and complicated and sometimes difficult, but it's real. And real, it turns out, is the only thing worth being. The exact moment you started losing yourself might be the most important moment of your life, but only if you let it teach you something. Only if you use it as a wake-up call rather than a life sentence. The dissociation, the numbness, the disconnection, these aren't signs that you're broken. They're signs that you're human, that you've been through things that required you to protect yourself, and that protection came at a cost. But protection isn't the same as living. Survival isn't the same as thriving. And somewhere inside you, beneath all the layers of performance and pretense, there's a version of yourself that's been waiting patiently for you to come back. So if you're reading this and something resonates, if you recognize that moment, that disconnection, that stranger in the mirror, know this: you haven't lost yourself permanently. You've just forgotten where you put yourself down. And the search, though difficult and sometimes painful, is the most worthwhile thing you'll ever do. Because at the end of it, you get to meet the most interesting person you'll ever know. Yourself, unfiltered and unapologetic, and finally, blessedly real. If this resonated with you, subscribe to hear more stories about the hidden psychology of being human. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I'd love to know where you're watching from.